Day 4, Off the Beaten Track, and I'm Martin Nutty.
And I'm John Lee. Join us back in the hidden heartlands of the Irish Midlands here on Irish Stew, our road trip made possible by our travel partner Tourism Ireland, which says of our next destination on their user-friendly guide, Ireland.com, you'll find sprawling formal gardens, ancient woodland paths, and a grand castle. The connections between science and nature are strong at Birr Castle. So we leave the cozy confines of Donnie Reagan's farm, where we learned about peatlands for prosperity, and head north to the lovely town of Birr, about 15 minutes away, to visit that most famous attraction, the Birr Castle Domain, where we focused on that science connection. I was in Birr Castle many more decades than I care to admit, probably 45 years ago. I came on a trip where I went to Clara after hitchhiking from Dublin. I ended up in Clara, where my maternal grandmother was from, and located my relatives, and they swept me into the family for a couple of days, and one of the stops along the way was Birr Castle, and that image of the Leviathan telescope has stuck with me all these years. So when Martin and I cooked up our off-the-beaten track in the hidden heartlands road trip idea, I said, we got to go back to Clara and we got to go back to Birr. And here we are. And we are joined today by Brian Kennedy, who is a local historian and on the board of this amazing facility here. Brian, welcome so much, and thanks for joining us on Irish Stew.
And you're very welcome to Birr also. I'm delighted to be with you today.
Brian, let's start here. We heard about John's relationship to the Birr domain, but tell me your first memory of this place.
First memory would be walking down here with my mother, I suppose, as a child. And in those days, going down to the garden to get vegetables. And then coming in with my father afterwards. He was a builder, and they had their own building section here in the castle that maintained it at the time. And coming in with him to get a chimney pot for an old house that he was restoring at the time. So they'd be my earliest memories of the castle, I must say, and being in the grounds of the castle.
Now, thinking about this place and your life in Birr, when did you realize there was a rich vein to mine in your backyard here that was surrounded by Birr Castle? When did your focus come onto this place?
I suppose my focus came on it, as you say, my profession as a teacher in St. Brendan's Community School in Birr. So it's when I started teaching that the focus probably came on Birr Castle, and you realised, particularly for the RSR, which is a project they have to do for leaving certificate, that it was a very rich vein, as you said, of history here, with the third Earl of Rosse in particular, the Leviathan, and his son Charles, the great engineer. So there was so much here, and from that then, of course, we would have had a family pass and been friends of the domain all along the years and renewed that over the years. And being a friend of the domain means you can walk here any day of the year, 363 days that the domain is open during the year, and go through the beautiful gardens and the science centre, which has been developed in the term of the current Earl of Rosse, who became Earl of Rosse in 1979.
There's so many directions we could go in talking about the Birr Castle. As I mentioned, the Leviathan stuck with me. But let's start off with the science. We're interested in the off-the-beaten-track stories, and this one does feel off the beaten track, the science aspect of the pretty amazing discoveries that were made here right up until this day almost.
Yeah, and it is right up to this day because it's still part of the whole telescope network that goes right out across Europe, and there's part of the telescope actually based here in the grounds and connected back to Trinity College in Dublin today. So that whole ILOFER project is still here in the castle itself. So they're still searching the skies above Birr. But going back to the genesis of where it all started was the second Earl of Rosse. And he became Earl of Rosse in 1807. Before that he was Sir Lawrence Parsons, and he just inherited a title, Earl of Rosse, in 1807 from his uncle. And he was the man who built the suspension bridge here in the castle. And that is possibly the oldest suspension bridge known in the world, still in existence. So you can see that they were innovators. They were there before their time. When you look at things maybe like the Golden Gate Bridge today and look at the other famous suspension bridges right throughout the world, it all began here in the grounds of Birr Castle with a man who had an ingenious mind for engineering in particular. And then his eldest son was William Parsons, and William was the third Earl of Rosse, the man who built the Leviathan telescope. Now, what was remarkable about that was, even though he was university educated himself, he built that telescope with untrained and illiterate workmen here on the estate. And it must have been a massive job to get himself and his engineers to explain to them alone how to actually build this structure and to put the plans into action. He was very fortuitous in marrying Mary Wilmer Field because she was a great heiress from Yorkshire. And Mary gave him the money that enabled him to build the telescope. For even though he had 22,000 acres of land at this stage and many tenants, he still would not have had the finance if she had not come in. So marrying Mary in today's terms was the equivalent to winning the lottery. And her money was put to very good effect here. During the famine period, they saved thousands of people from starvation by building the star-shaped moat, the keep gate on the way into the castle, and the boundary walls outside that were completed in the 1850s. So that money was put to very good effect, but a bulk of it went towards the building of the Leviathan.
As a podcast, we have the disadvantage of not being able to show the pictures while we talk. When people think they have an idea of what a telescope looked like. But what did this telescope look like?
It had a 6-foot mirror in it, and the mirror was down at the bottom of a massive timber tube that stretched about 20 feet up into the air. And to look into the telescope, you actually had to go to the top of it when it was up into the air, perpendicular. And you had to go up onto a platform in the middle of the night with a lamp with a red light in it. That was his only light. And he looked through the eyepiece of the telescope up there. So he was at least 20 feet above the ground when he was doing this. And that platform also had the ability to move in and out. So the telescope could move between the giant walls that hold it. So it had a movement of several feet in either direction, and it could also move up and down. So it was limited enough by today's standards. But by the standards of the time, it was the largest telescope in the world. And with its huge reflecting mirror, it lasted from 1845 to 1917 as the world's biggest telescope, even though it had been dismantled about 1915.
And to me, when I first saw it, it looked like a siege weapon or something. It has this kind of steampunk look about it, and you wouldn't immediately know it was a...
I suppose it looks like a timber cannon gun for all the world, and I can see exactly why you would have said it was a siege weapon. But they even built magnificent walls around it, and the whole idea of that was so that it would not look too much, I suppose, of an engineering project from the actual castle itself, that it just blended in with the Gothic architecture of the place. So you have these wonderful Gothic arches at the sides of it. It's well worth a visit for anybody, because what he discovered there alone, the spiral nebulae at the time and the whirlpool galaxies, and he plotted them to almost within an inch of what the Hubble telescope pictures took afterwards. They can be superimposed on one another. So it's absolutely fascinating what he was able to do. And many people believe that he also had tunnel vision, which, if his peripheral vision wasn't great, it helped him to scan the sky and to concentrate in a particular part of the sky. But his drawings are absolutely fantastic, and they have only been restored recently and were on display here in the Demesne for the whole summer.
And it's interesting because he drew these nebulae because there was no photography at that point in time, so that wasn't really an option.
It wasn't an option, and when you mention photography, his wife, Mary Wilmer Field, who funded the whole project, she was actually one of the world's first photographers, right up there at Fox Talbot and the others at the time. And we have some wonderful pictures here in the Science Museum that are taken from her glass plates going back to the 1850s of the family, including some of them who died quite young. It's interesting to note that even though they were a very privileged family, they had 13 children, Mary and William. Only 4 of the boys survived to adulthood, and the one girl died quite young. So out of 13 children, just 4 survived. And one of them, the youngest, was Charles, who became the great inventor. And Charles invented the steam turbine. So thanks to Charles, we have continuous electricity. We wouldn't actually have our mobile phones or our computers or any of our devices without Charles Parsons, who was actually reared here in Birr Castle. Now, he was born in London in 1854, but he came here as a child. He was tutored here privately. So he never actually went to school until he went to university in Dublin and later on to Oxford. But as the great inventor, he's probably a lot more famous than his father, but he's just overshadowed by the fact that the father had the biggest telescope in the world. And when he died in 1931, he left a fortune of over £700,000 at the time, which would be maybe 42 million in today's terms. So that just gives you an idea of the entrepreneur that he was. But unfortunately, his only son, Algernon, was killed in the First World War, and his daughter, Rachel, inherited his fortune but never married after. She was quite an eccentric character.
And surveying this family, the Earls of Rosse, the family name is Parsons, as I understand it, and Birr itself used to be called Parsonstown. How do you understand a family that is this innovative? Where does that spark come from? What do you look for? You said the second Earl of Rosse was building suspension bridges. His son is building magnificent telescope. His grandson invents the steam turbine engine.
Yeah.
What's going on here?
And remember, his other grandson also discovered the heat of the moon. He built a lunar machine to detect the heat of the moon, the fourth Earl of Rosse, Lawrence. Yeah, they were a remarkable family, and I think it goes back to their founder, back to the original Lawrence Parsons, who arrived here on the 7th of July, 1620. And he only lived for 8 years. He died in Rathfarnham Castle in 1628, just 8 years after coming to Birr. So I think it goes back to him, because within 8 years he had established the dynasty and left them in a position that they lasted for the last 400 years. He was a great man in his own right to have established that dynasty at that time. And the strength also came from his wife, who was known as Dame Anne. After his death, she steadied the ship. And two of his sons then took over. There was a Richard, and then William took over after that. So for every successive generation of the Rosses, there's a William and a Lawrence. And that continues up to the very day today. Like the present Earl is Brendan Parsons. We know him as Brendan, but his official title is William. His son is Lawrence Patrick, even though he's known as Patrick, and his son is William. So that's the succession. It still goes William Lawrence every second generation. So you really want to know which of them you're talking about. But like that innovation, I would say, has continued right up to the present Earl of Rosse, Brendan, who established the Science Centre here and had the foresight to restore the Leviathan and rescued the estate from considerable debt after his father died in 1979. I think a lesser individual would have just packed in. So that spirit is still there up to the present man who is here. And he's the 12th generation of the family to have existed here in Birr.
So tell us about the Science Centre. It sounds like it's carrying on the legacy and advancing it.
His whole vision was to build Ireland's historic science centre here in Birr. And that historic science centre really represents not just Birr's work, but the science in the whole country itself. And something that I suppose Ireland isn't particularly known for. And it promotes that whole idea. So in the galleries here, we have galleries contributing obviously to remembering the life of Mary Wilmer Field, the third Countess of Rosse, and her photography. And we even have a hologram of her speaking upstairs in one of the laboratories. And many of her photographs of the family and of the town in the 1850s are on display up there. So she was a scientist in her own right at the very innovation days of photography. And then we have a gallery, obviously, to Charles Algernon Parsons, the founder of the steam turbine. And of course, there's a very good visual of the work that we were talking about earlier, the drawings of the third Earl being superimposed on what the Hubble telescope had discovered. So as I say, it celebrates all of that. It celebrates the fact that the castle was one of the first houses in Ireland to have electricity. And again, they took that off of the River Camcar nearby. They had their own turbine on the river, and they were able to also transfer the power downtown. And there's quite a fascinating switch in the museum here that says town and castle, so it could be transferred from one to the other. Now, probably down to the Anglican church here, at the time, maybe not to the whole town, but when they weren't using the castle, when they were gone to church, they could switch the power down to the church itself. And it was the late 1870s, the beginning of electricity here in Birr. And in fact, a private company supplied the electricity up to 1949, when the Electricity Supply Board took it over. And they even had 2 more generators on the river down at Darrensallow, which is another part of the Rosse estate. And that powered the town up to, as I say, almost 1950, about 75 years ago.
And one of the other facets of the domain is the extensive gardens. So you see this shift from astronomy also into horticulture.
Yeah, very much, very much.
And that's a multi-generational...
Multi-generational, definitely. They always had the formal garden, which was traditionally well away from the house, where it is today. You turn right when you come out of the science centre down to the formal gardens. And in their present form, they still have hedges that date back to the original Parsons here. And they were among the tallest box hedges, not only in Europe, but in the world. And they still exist there from the 17th century. But the majority of the garden was laid out in 1935, when Anne Messels married the 6th Earl of Rosse, Michael Parsons. They will be the parents of the current Lord Rosse. And when she came to Birr, they laid out the gardens to commemorate their marriage in 1935. So it was laid out with hornbeam cloisters, which are pruned by the gardeners every year and have retained their shape. So it's like a medieval monastic cloister around the edges of the garden. And then there's some Bavarian urns, and it's about 300 years old. They also have the Peony Anne Rosse that was called after that particular Anne Messels, who married into the Parsons family, which is unique to the garden. It was propagated here in the garden and has a beautiful yellow flower and is much bigger than your normal peony. And then there's also the Birr lilac, and they are absolutely fantastic. They're purple and white in the springtime, and they line the avenue into the glass houses. And this year, one of the major projects that the foundation who run the grounds are undertaking is the restoration of the Victorian glass houses. So hopefully by next March, all the Victorian glass houses in the centre of the garden will be totally restored. And some of the plants from the botanic gardens from South America are coming here to be propagated at that stage. The seed is ready to be sown. So that goes back, and the reason they were built originally was some of the Rosses funded, particularly the 6th Earl of Rosse and the present Earl, the 7th Earl, funded expeditions to China. And many of the plants in the garden come from China, particularly going back to the 1930s. There were lots of trees planted about 1930, and they're unique to China. And in the springtime, the magnolias are absolutely magnificent down along the river. And it's significant that one of them, which is a champion tree, was planted to mark the baptism of the 7th Earl of Rosse in 1937. And it's still there in the garden across the river, in the river garden. We also have the history of Birr in the gardens here, because you have St. Brendan's Well. And St. Brendan is the patron of Birr. He was a 6th century saint, right back at the foundation of Christianity in Ireland. And his well is here in the grounds of the castle, so it would have encompassed part of his monastery, the original St. Brendan's Monastery. And he was one of the 12 apostles of Ireland, as they were known, who had studied under Finian at Clonard. And as I say, would be very significant in the early Irish church. He would be right up there, was a contemporary of St. Columcille and St. Kieran of Clarine and so on.
Yeah, we had the pleasure of visiting Clonmacnoise a couple of days ago, and of course familiarised ourselves, or I re-familiarised myself with the story of St. Kieran.
And that's one place we found a lovely advantage of traveling off-season. We had the place to ourselves. So we took pictures, and there was no one else in the picture, so a plus for off-season travel.
Very much, very much. And you talk about off-season travel. When you come to the castle gardens here in Birr, there's something in bloom every day of the year. Throughout the whole year, plants from right throughout the world. And there are certain sections of it where there are trees from Mexico, from Chile, and they each have their own quarter of the garden there, where they're planted exclusively. There are trees there have come from Nymans, which was the home of the 6th Countess of Rosse as well. And of course, there's a huge connection with the British royal family, because the present Earl's half-brother was Tony Armstrong-Jones, better known as Lord Snowdon, who married Princess Margaret, the Queen's sister.
Lord Snowdon was the photographer, as I recall, a famous photographer.
Yes, yes. He's a half-brother of Brendan Parsons here.
It was interesting that you mentioned that deeper history that attaches to this locale. I mentioned earlier on that Birr used to be called Parsonstown. Why did that shift take place, or when did that shift in naming?
Well, going back to 1620, when the original Parsons came, they named it Parsonstown at that stage. But the original name is Birr, which means a place of springs. And there are quite a lot of water springs around town, which St. Brendan's Well would be one very pure spring of those. So when they came 1620, it's named Parsonstown. And then under the Local Government Act of 1898, it reverted back to being Birr. The reason for that was, at that stage, the Conservative governments in England believed that the Home Rule movement in Ireland could be quietened down if it was killed with kindness. So if you were nice to people, if you gave them their own land, gave them fixity, a tenure on the land, allowed them to buy their own farms, made the standard of living better for them, that they had money in their pocket, and contented them in other ways, then they would no longer want Home Rule. They would want to stay within the British Empire. And I think part of that was that Local Government Act of 1898. And under that, as I say, it reverted back to the old name of Birr. So it was, in many ways, you could say it was a concessionary gesture to Irish nationalists.
And so this St. Brendan's Well, is this the same St. Brendan that would be known as St. Brendan the Navigator?
No, they were contemporaries. Brendan the Navigator is about 13 miles down the road here in Clonfert.
A different Brendan.
A different Brendan, the other side of the Shannon, and he's the patron of the Diocese of Clonfert and also associated with the Diocese of Kerry. So you have St. Brendan's Cathedral in Killarney, and he's the navigator. The fellow here, I'm afraid, didn't go too far. He's a native of the Dacia in Waterford, but he died here in Birr, even though he's buried on the Aran Islands.
Going back to the history of this area, away from the castle and the family, what was some of the early history of what is now Birr? Why did people settle here? What were they doing originally? What drew them to settlements around here?
The first settlement, as we've alluded to already, was St. Brendan's Monastery. So Birr was a place of learning and one of the great seats of learning. And in fact, it was here 1,300 years ago that the Law of Adamnan was actually established as a synod in Birr. When Adamnan, who is also known as Eunan in County Donegal, when he came over from Iona, and he established what is more commonly known as the Law of the Innocents. And basically it was the protection of women and children and clerics in battle, whereas in the old days women and children were pushed out in the forefront of the battle. This was to protect women and children. So it was the first, you could say, Human Rights Act. And all of our human rights acts that go back when we think of Gaza and all of the conflict areas in the world today, it originates from that synod here in Birr. So it was a place of learning. It was a farming community, and Birr would traditionally be surrounded by fairly good farming land, particularly as you go out into North Tipperary, which is only a mile away from us. You're going into the Golden Vale. So it was a town that provided for people. And then maybe in the early 19th century, from about the year 1812 onwards, you had the barracks here in Crinkle. And there were about 1,000 British soldiers stationed here. And that provided quite a spin-off as well, because you had to feed 1,000 people, and coal was supplied to the barracks, all of the various services that they needed. There was a great spin-off industry in that as well. So that kept it going for the 19th century. Throughout the 20th century, then the Parsons themselves were very innovative in many of the things. There was a factory established here under the tariff system in the 1930s to make shoes and boots, Birr Shoe Company. The Earl of Rosse was the major shareholder in that. And later on they established what was known as a moquette factory, where they made a kind of a rough material that was used in particularly the seating in buses and so on, right up into the 1980s, 1990s. And as I say, the Earl of Rosse was the major shareholder in both of those companies. Later on then in the 20th century, you had the exploitation of the bogs outside of Birr, and other areas in Offaly started to prosper as a result of that. but not so much Birr. Birr wasn't really that much connected with Bord-na-Mona. There were some workers here, but they were more down in Clachan, Forban and Kilcormac and those areas.
And what drives the town at this point in time? Obviously, the Demesne here is a big attraction from a tourist point of view.
The Demesne is the major attraction in the town. It brings between 70 and 100,000 visitors a year into Birr, and there are a huge number of people come, particularly from America, to here to visit. So it's a big generator of employment. Our other main employer would be Grant Engineering, where they started off making back boilers for open fires, for solid fuel fires, and now they have obviously moved with the times, and they're making all kinds of heat recovery systems and just for underfloor heating and particularly electric heating. So they've gone into that, and they employ anything up to 300 people here in the town itself. So otherwise it would be a town that would provide services. You would have 2 very good hotels in the town, and it would provide services for the areas around it here.
You mentioned how many tourists, and many of them from North America, and the lion's share of our audience is from North America. What would they want to know to come to Birr and have a great time and to walk away with great memories?
I'd say, first of all, they need to come here into the castle. Come early in the morning, because one day is just not enough to take in all that the castle has to offer. We mentioned the science centre, we've mentioned the gardens, there's a history of the family, and from May to September, the actual castle itself is open for tours, which can be booked. And you can go through the staterooms of the castle, the dining room, the library, the Gothic music saloon, which is reputed as being the most gracious room anywhere in Ireland. It's a fabulous Gothic structure. And the yellow drawing room that was set out by Anne Messels and decorated by her. That's enough alone to fill a whole morning without going out into the extensive grounds at all. And as I say, for anybody who's into horticulture, botany, trees, biodiversity, it's all here. There's a 14-acre lake in the castle itself. There are 11 kilometres of paths. So there's so much to do. So my advice to anybody from America would be come early in the morning. There's a lot here. We have a restaurant on site in the summer and so on. We have the museum. We have plenty to look at all kinds of weather. And like next year, we will have the restored glass houses as well to take on your tour. So there's history here. In the town itself, there's a fabulous Georgian heritage that comes largely from the work again of the second Earl of Rosse. He more or less built a fabulous model town in many ways. His earlier ancestor had built Emmet Square, which expanded the town northwards. But the 2 Georgian streetscapes, Oxman Town Mall and John's Place, are still almost intact as they were in 1835, around the time when they were built. They still have their sash windows. They have the fabulous Georgian doors with the half-spoke wheel fan lights. In fact, one of them, the parochial house, has a most beautiful spider's web fan light. So they're worth looking at in their own right. There are 2 fabulous Gothic revival churches. There's a Church of Ireland at the other end of the road coming out the main gate of the castle here. And then the Roman Catholic Church is just 200 years old. Fabulous spire, 126 feet into the sky. It has the oldest stained glass window designed by Pugin. And right next door to us was the former Mercy Sisters Convent. And that again was designed by Augustus Webley Northmore Pugin, the famous architect of the House of Commons in England. And again, it's a Gothic revival building, but he gives some acknowledgement of Irish history in putting in a round tower, for example, a mock round tower for their bell tower. And there's a perfect cloister in the centre. So there's one cloister out in the garden here, and there's another one in the former convent. That today is the town library, and it's wide open for people to go into the old Gothic Pugin Chapel, which is absolutely fabulous. The ceiling is all restored in it, and the paintings and so on. Roman Catholic Church is open every day, so anybody can go into those buildings. And as I say, the Catholic Church is basically as it was in the 1840s when the fabulous vaulted ceiling was put in and so on. So you can go around the town. There are other river walks down the town, quite similar to the ones in the grounds here of the castle itself. And then the centre of the town, the main street, has many shops that will be of interest to people and able to buy curiosities and groceries. and so on there if they need anything, any refreshments. And we have 2 hotels as well owned by the Gary family. There's the County Arms Hotel, which is a 4-star hotel. It has its own leisure centre and over 120 bedrooms there. Specialises in weddings. And more recently they've purchased the Dooley's Hotel in the Square, which again is one of the oldest hotels in Ireland, established in 1747. And it's run under the name Dooley since 1747, even though the Dooley family are gone since about 1900. But it was a Bianconi coaching inn originally, where they would have changed the horses for the old coaching service. So as I said, there's plenty there for anybody in the town itself and in the vicinity around it. You go out then, we have the Slieve Bloom Mountains just 10 miles from Birr and the beautiful picturesque village of Kinnity, and a castle out there. There's another hotel there that's also being extensively renovated this winter. And then just to the south of the town, you have the very historic town of Roscrea with its castle, and the Cistercian monastery is just outside the town there. So there's quite a lot for people around here.
And that, I think, is a very comprehensive list of activities you can engage in this part of the world. John and I are on our 3rd day, I believe, in the Midlands, and we're finding a density of locations and destinations that are available. Because one of the things we were trying to achieve on this podcast was promote the notion of plunking down in the Midlands, which is not a traditional destination for many people. A lot of times people come into Dublin and then they just head straight to the West Coast. And so what we wanted to expose is the richness of experience that's available and the beauty of this part of the country. I can't imagine a much better advocate of the immediate area than you, Brian. So on behalf of our listeners, but before we do that, we want to introduce into the room our friend Seamus Plug. So this is your opportunity to plug something that's near and dear to your heart. So please have at it.
Well, I say to your many listeners, if you are coming to Ireland, don't just go down around the wild Atlantic way. There is far more to Ireland than Dublin or the West Coast. Come here to the Midlands and visit Birr Castle Demesne. It is well worth a visit. You will not be disappointed, no matter what time of the year you come, and you will be guaranteed to receive a very warm welcome. And we look really forward to you coming to here, to the heart of the Midlands, and hope that your visit with us will be memorable for all the right reasons.
It took me almost 45 years to come back, but here I am. I wanted to say it again. Thank you so much, Brad. Really appreciate it.
John, I can't imagine a more eloquent advocate for any town than Brian Kennedy. He's really an expert on all things Birr, both the domain and the town itself. And I have to say, despite a miserable weather day, because of the residue of Hurricane Umberto, we really did manage to enjoy the whole experience. The gardens were spectacular. The reconstructed Leviathan, you gotta pay a visit to that. And the town itself of Birr, as Brian had suggested, is a wonderful place to take an amble, and we stopped off in the Villa Cafe to have, in my case, a flat white, and the people in there were just lovely. So a really enjoyable visit to Birr, and please do this. Make sure you visit irishstewpodcast.com, because we'll post pictures of these places. We can only paint so much using our words. So do visit irishstewpodcast.com, and we'll post some pictures on the episode page. You'll see the link in the show notes.
And thanks to all, especially Birr Castle's Daniel Nagel, who handled all the details of our visit. And as things go in Ireland, he's from the town we're going to next. He was a student of our next guest and a classmate of another guest on that next episode. Well, that beats Banagher, the River Shannon town we're going to take you to next week. And until then, thanks to our travel partner, Tourism Ireland, and our media partner, irishcentral.com.
Irish Stew is produced by John Lee, Martin Nutty, and Bill Schultz. Editing, mixing, and mastering by Bill Schultz. Music on Irish Stew was composed and performed by Rosa Nutty, with Donald Bowens on drums, Cathal O'Riordan on bass and synthesizer. For more on Rosa Nutty's music, please visit rosanutty.com.